I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 106. And this week it is Terri's turn to share another chapter from Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart. What have you got for us today, Terri?
Well, Daisy, I'm going to share from chapter 10, and the chapter is entitled Places We Go When the Heart is Open. And the first concept that is discussed in this chapter of the book is love. And you can tell in listening to this that Brené Brown has quite an affinity for bell hooks.
I loved how she described. She said something about carrying her book around and how she described reading it or studying her work as giving her stretch marks on her brain, something like that. I really liked that image.
Mm-hmm. So one of the concepts she brings from that book, a statement from bell hooks, is everywhere we learn that love is important, and yet we are bombarded by its failure. And I thought this was pretty powerful because I think that's true. We are taught that love is the most important thing and it's so important, and yet we see it not working and crumbling and being broken and things. She refers to it as kind of a preoccupying and strong desire for strong connection. It's an emotional context in which to strengthen relationships. And then Brené Brown discusses and laughs when she shares this, that there's quite a debate among researchers about whether love is actually an emotion. And it's interesting because I've always heard this as well being referred to as love is a verb. You can feel loved. That loved is maybe an emotional experience, but love itself is a verb that, it's an action word. So anyway, she talked about in one study where they had college students look at a whole bunch of kind of emotion words and describe to what degree is this an emotion. Not very much an emotion to absolutely this is an emotion. And love received the highest rating of emotion from them. So whether it fits the research definition or not, it certainly seems to fit people's experiential way of understanding it.
And she's talked about that before, hasn't she, with definitions? She says, it's all very well having these theoretical definitions, but she very much believes in the popular lived experience type definition.
Which is kind of funny because the definition she provides from her research team, I think, is very theoretical. And no one, I think, if you on the street said to them, what is love? Would you get a definition this long and this broad? But the definition...
Did you write it down? I wrote it down.
I did. The definition
it's a good one.
She provided is, we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor that spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. Love is not something that we give or get. It is something that we nurture and grow, a connection that can be cultivated between two people only when it exists within each one of them. We can love others only as much as we love ourselves. Shame, blame, disrespect, betrayal, and the withholding of affection damage the roots from which love grows. Love can survive these injuries only if they are acknowledged, healed, and rare. Again, if you asked me what love is, Daisy, I don't think I would give you that definition, but I certainly think this covers so much of it. She then talks about kind of the opposite, lovelessness. And I really didn't take any notes on this because it got more into kind of a commentary on social political environment in which we are currently finding ourselves and the kind of call, and this is where I think she talks about bell hooks book being something that she used so heavily in her first teaching courses, that we need to do all things with more love. And Brené Brown says, not the unicorn, rainbow, heart kind of love, not the commercial kind of love, but a more genuine love. And unfortunately, so much of our ways that we make decisions in our world today is actually without love.
That's when she was talking about love ethic, I think, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And tying it all to strong moral values, standing up for those, and not being fearful of radical change, justice seeking, were the notes I wrote round about that.
Mm-hmm.
Love ethic. You can hear that when she was talking about it. It certainly ties in with a lot of the work she does, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I know the things that because I wrote that quote out as well, but there were two parts that I underlined. And the first one was, love is not something that we give or get. It's something that we nurture and grow. And I think the same thing that she mentioned with the love ethic is, it's something that you've got to work at. It takes work. It's not some passive thing. And then the other part was that we can love others only as much as we love ourselves. Those were the two key bits that I pulled out.
Exactly. And I think this is why I go back to the idea that from my own, puzzling this out at all, is that love is a verb. It's an active thing that you do, or it can be a noun. It is something, an object that you grow and nurture, but that it's not really descriptive of an emotion, though obviously we have emotions tied to it. Of course, talking about love then leads to talking about heartbreak. And this was probably the part that I could relate to the best. And this is, she described it as is more than just a painful type of disappointment or hurt. That it's a special kind of hurt because it involves the loss of that sense of love and belonging. So it's like an additional layer of hurt beyond disappointment. Heartbreak is what happens when love is lost. And this could happen in a love relationship, like a love partner, unrequited love, the death of a loved one, change or death of something unique about someone. And she described when her kids no longer were little kids and became adolescents, like she was heartbroken over that loss of innocence and the roles that they shared with her. So not only is it a heartbreak as far as a love relationship as in romantic, and in pulling from other people's work, she said that heartbreak is the loss or perceived loss of love. And every time we love, we risk the loss of love. And it's kind of a requirement. If you're not willing to risk the loss, you don't get to experience the love. And that reminded me of a story, and she talks a little bit about losing their first dog. But it reminds me of a time when one of my good friends had a dog that was very old and ready to go, and she couldn't do it. And so she had a friend and I take the dog to the veterinary office to be euthanized. And I was sitting in the car holding the dog, sobbing. It was not even my dog, and I was sobbing. And I said, this is ridiculous. I'm never getting a dog. Why would anyone get a dog if this is what you have to go through? And the other friend looked at me and she said, it is really horrible having to do this, but it's so worth it because look at all the years, like this dog was 14 or 15 years old. Look at all the years of joy and love and companionship. So it made me think a little differently as I now have had several dogs again.
And for some people, it is too much. I know people who refuse to get another dog because the pain of losing their first dog was too much and they can't do it.
Absolutely.
It's only one of the reasons why I don't just have one dog, but it is one of the reasons why I don't have one dog. The absolute heartbreak of that dog not being around anymore. It's hard enough when you've got the others to pull you through. But yeah, but it is true, isn't it? You can't have one without the other. I can remember when I was at school, it was A levels, so 17, 18 years old, that sort of age, and studying one of Keats' poems, Ode on Melancholy, and it talks about this principle that true happiness and joy and melancholy, they live in the same place. You can't have one without the other. I can remember being it was such a light bulb moment. And although one thing is so difficult, How can you appreciate one without having the other? You don't have that comparison.
That's right.
You can't truly love unless you felt heartbreak, and vice versa.
And mind you, as Daisy was talking about having more than one dog, over her shoulder, I can see 2 dogs sharing a dog bed, so cutely curled up, with a cat slumped over the side of the bed with her head probably touching one of the dogs. It's quite cute. Brené Brown shared her own quote about this, and I thought this was pretty powerful. "The brokenhearted are the bravest among us. They dared to love." So moving beyond heartbreak, she then moves into trust and talked about how this is really choosing to risk making something that you value vulnerable to another person's actions. And then distrust is the assessment that what is important to me is not safe with this person. And I think trust obviously is very important in relationships. And once we experience distrust with someone, that complicates the relationship quite a bit. Again, kind of talking about it similar to love, is that trust is not really an emotion, more of a cognitive assessment of something.
It does make sense, because you do kind of have to make that assessment of whatever it is you're deciding whether to trust or not. Yes, you'll have a gut feeling, part of it, but there's still an assessment that goes on, isn't there?
I have a feeling that there's also something, as I was listening to this chapter and others, that my past as an English teacher gets in the way a little bit, because to me it's about trust is not an emotion, but I can feel trusting of someone. So I just have to change the participle on the word, and I get or change the ending on a word, and I get a different meaning of it. Moving it from a noun assessment to an emotion to a verb. Anyway, I caught myself thinking of that often. So she talked about her team and a definition they use, and it took a while to explain this, but around trust, and they use the word braving, and then each letter being an important component of trust. So B is for boundaries, having boundaries and acknowledging and respecting boundaries. 2 is reliability. Doing what you say you're going to do is important in allowing someone to trust you. Accountability, that you take accountability for your actions. V is for vault, meaning that you don't share what should not be shared, something that should be kept confidential. I is for integrity, that you act true to a higher value rather than just doing what is fun or what is maybe more rewarding. N is for non-judgmental, and G is for generosity. And I thought this was an interesting one, is that you apply the most generous interpretations to the actions, intentions, and words of the other. John Gottman, who she mentions later, talked about this in couples work, that assuming positive intent is so important, that
difficult to do. Often.
And difficult. But if you instantly jump to this person did this on purpose, why are they doing this to me? Versus, wait, I know they love me. They are doing something. Maybe they thought this was going to be helpful. Let me say this differently.
Very
that
different
can make
perspective.
a huge difference. Brené Brown then talked about self-trust, and she talked about her own experience in sobriety and how much that experience has helped her to increase her ability in self-trust. She mentioned that self-trust is often the first casualty when things don't go well or we fail at something, that we turn kind of first on ourselves. And this trust leads right into the topic of betrayal. And important thing about betrayal is that researchers really define that there would have had to have been trust first. Otherwise, it would not really be experienced as betrayal. And she talked about the fact that when betrayal is perpetrated by close people, parents, loved one, that it can result in what she referred to as a betrayal trauma. And when we are injured by betrayal, our resulting feelings are pretty vast, but things like humiliation, jealousy, decreased self-worth, anxiety, depression, anger, and even trauma symptoms. So the significance of betrayal in how it's experienced when you are the one feeling betrayed. And then she also talked about institutional betrayal, which I thought was an important concept. I didn't write down many notes about this, but just the idea that this is when it's an institution that people have trust in, but feel betrayed because for example, the access is not granted. If I am a person of color, can I get into that country club where my community members are, or a doctor or an attorney or someone who has kind of institutional power and betrays the trust of the people.
Yes, the thing I pulled from that was that there's always a power differential and much effort to protect the institution in question. Cover up is a very typical word that comes up, and that there is always complicity and shame involved, and that yes, all sorts of things with this complicity and then shame and blame. And well, I won't say it neatly goes on to the next subject because I'm sure you'll do that in a minute. But the only other thing I noted from that was that she said there's only one way back from betrayal, and that is with accountability, amends, and action. So it comes back a little bit back to that term she referred to as love ethic, having those strong moral values and standing up for them, not being fearful of radical change. I can see that coming into play a lot with this institutional betrayal. Like you said, it's often going to involve things like racism, sexism, homophobia, these kind of things where you get that group, herd, pack mentality, and complicity and shame come into play. And it can be a very, very difficult thing to stand up to. But very unfair. And yes, you can see how betrayal is the perfect word. That's what it's going to feel like when you feel like you've been, especially if it's an institution that you've believed in and you felt a part of, and you end up feeling betrayed by.
Which, of course, then leads to the next term, which, again, I didn't focus on as much, but just defensiveness, that you're most likely to defend that group or yourself when recognizing that others have been hurt. And if acknowledging that and taking accountability is complicated for you, most likely you're going to be responding instead in defensiveness. And you did a great episode on this very early in our time together, which I think was a Brené Brown episode, maybe.
It's a very difficult one. It's certainly something I struggle with, defensiveness, on a, going back to more of a personal way that defensiveness comes up. And they described it, at its core, a way to protect the ego and fragile self-esteem. And she talks about grounded confidence being the opposite for fragile self-esteem, where you accept your own imperfections and you don't feel that they diminish your self-worth. But yes, trying not to fall into defensiveness when you feel under attack, criticized, it's a very difficult thing. It's certainly something I struggle with.
And in the experience of, or in this whole kind of mix of betrayal and defensiveness, and, anytime your heart is open and things get heated, she talked about the concept of flooding. And this is a sensation or feeling psychologically and physically overwhelmed during conflict, making it virtually impossible to make a problem-solving conversation something productive. And this was from John Gottman, who does an incredible amount of work with couples therapy. And when you are flooded, you can't engage with the conversation. And she talked about, for herself, she's learned she's needed to take breaks, say, this is a lot for me right now. I'm going to go get a drink of water. Can we come back to this in 10 minutes? In her marriage, she talked about the fact that we might all experience flooding, but do different things with it. So her husband shuts down when he's flooded. And she goes in and says, come on, we have to talk about this. Let's go. And that's what she learned in her family. So recognizing that flooding can look different for different people. Some people shut down, which is what I do, and other people might become more aggressive or almost combative. And then the last big concept she talks about is hurt. And she said that one of the most brave sentences is to acknowledge my feelings are hurt, or to say, this really hurt my feelings. That is one of the most brave things we can do. And she then talked about the idea of hurt feelings, that it's a mix of feelings, and it takes on a new kind of sensation. And she describes it to her teenage son as kind of like rainbow snow cone. It's not all of the different flavors all mixed. You don't taste them individually, but now it's this new flavor, even though there are all these others. So hurt feelings can be a myriad of different painful experiences, uncomfortable, could be anger. And she describes then that when we have hurt feelings, when we respond to them with anger, we often trigger more anger from the other person. And so I used to describe this as from another author, Harriet Lerner, where it was just an escalation. I'm going to outdo you with my anger. You're going to have to come back and outdo me. And we just escalate. And so talking about if instead you can share your hurt feelings without the anger, the other person is usually better able to apologize, maybe take that accountability, not respond with defensiveness. And then the two of you can work toward solution or solving.
I think that's often where the difficulty comes in, because it does take some, again, we talked about bravery before, but it does take some bravery to be able to say to somebody that they've hurt your feelings. There's that element of confrontation. But I guess if you've had a response to that, if you have felt brave enough to say that out loud, and then it's been dismissed, it's a very difficult thing to do again. It is, I know when she said that, it's a really difficult thing to say. It's something I'll rarely be able to say that to somebody.
She also talked about that hurt feelings are most often caused in close relationships when we feel devalued or rejected. And usually the thing that hurt our feelings was not intended, but was thoughtless, careless, or insensitive. But if we get a sense that it was intentional, the more intentional it was, the greater the hurt and the more difficult the repair. So I think these are all just important things to think about. These are all around the whole idea of your heart being open, which makes us vulnerable, open to the risks of being hurt, but also that's what helps us to connect more and to experience love and to experience trust. So really important chapter here. So hopefully everyone can take some things from this and continue to think about, what do you do when your heart is open? How do you share with others? How do you take risks to repair when things are challenging? And again, that idea of self-trust, even how do you do this within yourself?
Yes, and there was one little tip that I took from the subject of defensiveness that she talked about, to watch out for the physical cues when you're feeling defensive, and maybe come up with some strategies of how to deal with that in the moment. She talked about, I think sort of clenching fists and folding your arms and things like that, but being aware that those physical cues are telling you you're defensive, but to think about in the moment, it's probably not going to be that easy, but think about another time. I think she said something about putting her palms upward and saying something about having to take a moment, something like that, but something a practiced strategy that you can roll out in that moment of defensiveness, because all you're doing is closing down when you're feeling defensive.
Absolutely.
So that's something I took, as it's something I struggled with. But yes, as always, very thought-provoking. I think we're probably moving on to our last but one chapter next week. It's a great book. Encourage everyone to go and read or listen to it.
Absolutely.
Tell us what you think. In the meantime, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody. Bye-bye.